This will be the most corrupt election in the history of our country.
Welcome to The Real News. I'm Jess Lenore. The United States is on the path to cementing minority rule over the majority for decades to come.
Our reproductive rights are on the line. Our labor rights are on the line. Our right to health care is on the line. Labor and union protections are on the line. Our climate is on the line.
Republicans, who hold a majority in the Senate despite receiving over 12 million fewer votes than Democrats, say they have the votes to confirm President Trump's nominee to fill the seat of late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg before the November 3rd election. Trump won the electoral vote in 2016 despite receiving over 3 million fewer votes than Hillary Clinton. This is Lindsey Graham speaking on Fox News.
We've got the votes to confirm Justice Ginsburg's replacement before the election. We're going to move forward in the committee. We're going to report the nomination out of the committee to the floor of the United States Senate so we can vote before the election.
Democrats' hope of getting the necessary 4 Republicans to block the confirmation of Ginsburg replacement were dashed when Senators Mitt Romney, Cory Gardner, and Chuck Grassley all said they did support a vote before the election. Progressives like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have urged Democrats to do everything in their power to stop Republicans. And Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said he would consider expanding the Supreme Court if Democrats win control of the Senate in November.
Well, it will be a decision that comes to the Senate. We first have to win the majority before that can happen. But once we win the majority, God willing, everything is on the table.
Well, now joining us to discuss this and what we can do about it is a journalist who has compiled what'sontheballot.com, a list of over 300 key races across the country. Daniel Nashanian covers criminal justice, local elections, voting rights, political theory, founder and editorial director of The Appeal, Political Report, and a constant, incredible presence on Twitter where he tweets at Daniel, which is a really valuable resource. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So your, response and reaction, obviously the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is a, very powerful force shaping politics in the Supreme Court as a very important liberal justice, and how the days, preceding her death have unfolded. Republicans have the votes, it would seem, to confirm a replacement before the November 3rd election. Your reaction to this?
I think everyone who follows the politics of the Supreme Court or U.S. politics in general knew the risk of the health of Justice Ginsburg for a long time, and so immediately on Friday night, it was the extent of the ramifications of the death were clear to everyone. The ramifications of a 6-3 conservative Supreme Court are so huge across all of the areas that you've already mentioned, and frankly, so many other. It's I think we aren't quite even we're just at the beginning of even conceiving of the extent of jurisprudence of the past 34 years that is going to be on the line in the composition of the Supreme Court. What's interesting in what you said about how the Republicans have the votes is that we really have gotten rid of the pretense that what we are judging is the qualifications of a Supreme Court justice. Obviously, the Supreme Court has always been a very ideological institution, an institution that has decided huge swath of policy in this country. And we were kind of dancing around that for a very long time through veneer of talking about impartiality or calling balls and strikes. But now Republicans have come out to say we have the votes prior to even a nominee being announced, and there's a clarification of the stakes of the court on all sides.
So on one hand, you have the GOP who has, they've had this laser focus on stacking the courts, and this has been a top priority of them for decades. And then you have, progressives like AOC saying, urging the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, who in a joint press conference on Sunday, which we saw a clip of, Schumer is saying, they're considering expanding the Supreme Court, which would be one way to deal with this, expanding the court, something that's been done before in American history, something that FDR floated in 1937 when, parts of the New Deal were being struck down. But on the other hand, Joe Biden has previously opposed this. I mean, obviously before the current, before I haven't seen any recent statements, but on the campaign trail, he's opposed this idea. We have some Democratic senators coming out and opposing this idea. So Democrats still need to get their party together and figure out what their strategy is going to be going forward.
Absolutely, and the ramifications of a 6-3 court for specifically voting rights and the rules of voting and the rules of who holds power are so huge that has to be at the forefront of the minds of Democrats. The ramifications for who draws map with what rules, a lot of it could go out the window in terms of what has even constrained lawmakers up until now in terms of how they draw map. So what's on the line isn't just the policy areas or this jurisprudence, it's who's going to be able to hold authority and power over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And that has to be weighing heavily on the minds of Democrats. We're going to have a very small window in 2021 to do something about it. And I think that just the game and the conversation has changed with the flip-flop on the Republican side between 2016 and 2020.
And there was anger at Mitch McConnell, which resulted in his opponent Amy McGrath getting tens of millions of dollars donated virtually overnight. But there are other Senate races which are far closer. Can you talk about what some of those races are? Because Democrats aren't going to have the power to do anything unless they retake the Senate, where they only have 47 votes right now.
Absolutely. A lot of the conversation about what Democrats should do next goes out the window immediately if Democrats don't both win the White House and the Senate and keep the House in November. So that's the next step in terms of what Democrats can do, is actually win these elections in difficult conditions, often given the situation of the pandemic. It's still very much a very tight situation whether or not Democrats can do that. What is striking is that there's so many races that can be considered contested and competitive right now, but only a few of them really seem to be leaning on the side of Democrats. So those are in particular Arizona, Colorado, and perhaps Maine. Then when we look at Iowa and North Carolina, and Georgia has actually 2 Senate seats this fall. When we look at Kansas, even Texas, when we look at South Carolina, and I'm surely leaving out some. There's about 7 to 10 Senate races that are conceivably and plausibly pickups by Democrats, but that still demand a lot of work. All of these candidates have raised a lot of money since Friday night, and it doesn't look like at this point cash will be the obstacle for Democrats going into November 3rd in terms of whether they can expand the map of the Senate. And the bigger majority Democrats have, if they win it, the more it's plausible to talk about the kind of things you were asking about, because Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema, there are senators who are who might be uncomfortable with bolder moves come 2021, and having some room might be in the majority, if there is a majority, will be essential for Chuck Schumer to be able to push anything through.
And finally, you've raised the point that if the what seems like inevitable happens and the Supreme Court is stacked, it's going to make these local races happening across the country, many of them which are contested. We've seen a record number of progressives win primaries, taking on entrenched incumbents. You have created this catalog of over 300 races across the country that are worth paying attention to. Obviously, we can't get through all of them, but can you talk about what No,
of course.
Why you selected some of these races, and what is most interesting to you this year?
Well, it's been a long time thought that there's so many levers of power across the country, up and down the ballot, up and down institutions. a lot of them in places, in institutional spaces that people don't necessarily associate with the breadth of policy decision-making they have. I'm thinking of places like DA's offices and other law enforcement officials. I'm thinking of county commissions and mayors, and we are really seeing over the summer with the renewed protest around BLM, we're really seeing the breadth of authority and powers that DAs and sheriffs and mayors have. And yet these elections still to this day remain uncontested. To the extent that they're contested, the policy options that are very vast that are at play are not necessarily at the forefront of the coverage, if to the extent that there really is a lot of coverage. And that's a problem, obviously much before the latest news that we've been discussing, but it's also a problem, it's also a challenge now that a lot of the federal protections might be eroded in a 6-3 court, and frankly, even in a 5-4 court, there already were a lot of questions about what federal protections stood at the precipice. And winning power for progressives in state spaces is not a panacea. It is not going to stop the erosion of federal protections, which are going to affect a lot of the country. But it is one space where it is going to be very important to focus coverage and for progressive to focus attention. Just as one example, there's a lot of states still that have bans on abortion in the book. So if Roe versus Wade were to be overturned, it would trigger back the restrictions that have remained on the book but haven't been operative. To what extent have states introduced bills and laws to protect the rights that are now potentially under threat, especially if the court becomes a 6-3 majority? To what extent are bluer jurisdictions electing prosecutors who are committed to ending the death penalty and will not seek it if the Supreme Court, for instance, is no longer really as promising a path, to the extent that it really was promising in recent years, to restrict the death penalty? And there's so many questions like that. So I invite anyone to go to What's on the Ballot, which is just a place where I've tried to aggregate some of what I've seen to be comprehensive about places that have stakes. And I actually tried to include at least one election that isn't federal from every state, often many more than one. And so people can hopefully find a race in their state that they can care about. And I will also add that a lot of the races are Supreme Court elections at the state level. And that is going to be very important going forward. We saw just over the past few years, Supreme Courts in Pennsylvania and North Carolina, for instance, give very important decisions on voting rights issues and gerrymandering. And those were based on state law and state constitutions, so not dependent on the federal court system, which has been really stacked up by President Trump. And the composition of many Supreme Courts is at stake this year, including partisan control in Ohio and Michigan, and the composition in North Carolina, which I just mentioned. And those will be so essential to the extent that progressives think there's a strategy to be pursued in court systems to leave out some open paths to be able to do that.
Well, we're almost out of time, but Daniel, thank you so much for all of your work and for joining us today. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
Thank you for joining us at the Real News Network.